Cora Halloran dropped her two worn carpet bags in the dirt of the Thorn Ranch yard. The dust, fine as milled flour, puffed up in a silent tan protest around the frayed bottoms. Her son Samuel, a boy of 6 with eyes that held the ancient stillness of deep water, stood beside her, his small hand a permanent fixture in hers. He did not look at the ramshackle ranch house or the tired, gray-faced man who now stood on the porch, wiping his hands on a rag that had given up on cleanliness long ago. Samuel looked at his mother's face because that was where his world began and ended. Cora looked at the man on the porch. He was the owner, Elias Thorne, a name she'd gotten from a liveryman in dusty Prairie Ridge, a name spoken with a mix of pity and dismissal. "He's got land, but the luck's run out of it," the man had said. Luck was a luxury Cora Halloran could no longer afford to consider. "Ma'am," Elias Thorne said. His voice was like rocks grinding in a dry creek bed. It wasn't welcoming. It wasn't hostile. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated weariness. He was a man running on the fumes of stubbornness. Cora took a breath, the high, thin air of the panhandle a sharp reminder of how far she was from the green rolling hills of Ohio, from the life that had been burned away to ash and memory. She squared her shoulders, a movement so slight it was more a shift in her soul than in her body. "Mr. Thorne," she began, her voice steady, clear, and utterly devoid of pleading. "I am told you need a cook, a housekeeper." Elias Thorne let his eyes travel from her face to the boy, to the twin bags that held everything she owned in the world. He saw the respectable but threadbare dress, the way her hands, though clean, bore the faint, indelible marks of hard labor. He saw a widow. He saw a refugee from some private, unseen war. He'd seen them before. They came with desperation clinging to them like burrs, full of tears and stories of woe, and they were always, always more trouble than they were worth. They broke easy. The land broke them, or loneliness did. "I ain't hiring," he said. The words were flat, final. He turned as if to go back inside, the conversation already over in his mind. "You will hire me," Cora Halloran said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, delivered with such quiet, unyielding certainty that it stopped him with one foot over the threshold. He turned back slowly, his eyes narrowing. The gray in them sharpened, like creek stones after a rain. "Is that so?" he asked, a dangerous quiet entering his tone. "Your men are eating salted beef and hardtack 3 nights a week," she continued, her gaze sweeping the yard, noting the broken pump handle tied with fraying rope, the untidy stack of firewood, the general air of things slowly coming undone. "Your cook quit 2 weeks ago after Jed. Your foreman, I'd wager, threw a plate at the wall because the beans were burned again. Your last housekeeper left in tears because the wind never stops crying, and she was afraid of mice. You have a ledger you can't balance, clothes that need mending, and a winter coming that doesn't care if you're tired." Elias Thorne's face was a mask of stone. He walked down the 3 porch steps until he was standing a mere 10 feet from her. He was a tall man, made taller by a life of looking out over wide, empty spaces. "You've been talking to folks in town." "I've been listening," she corrected him gently. "There's a difference. Talk is cheap gossip. Listening is gathering facts. The fact is, you need competence. I am offering it. The fact is, you are losing money on wasted supplies and poor morale. I can stop that. I am not looking for charity, Mr. Thorne. I am proposing a business transaction, room and board for myself and my son, and a wage of $20 a month. In return, I will run your house, manage your supplies, and make this place sufferable for the men who work it." He stared at her, a long, unnerving silence stretching between them. The wind, as if on cue, picked up, whipping a strand of her brown hair across her face. She did not brush it away. Her eyes, a clear and honest hazel, did not waver. He was used to pleas, to tears, to flirtation, to manipulation. He was not used to this. This calm, direct accounting of his own failures. It was then that the crisis happened. Not a grand one, not a stampede or a gunshot, but a small domestic disaster that was, in its own way, just as telling. A young ranch hand, no older than 17, came running from the bunkhouse, his face a mess of panic. Mr. Thorne, the pump handle. It snapped clean off. Silas was trying to get it to catch, and the whole damn thing just gave way. Elias swore, a low guttural sound of pure frustration. The well was the lifeblood. No water meant no coffee, no washing, no watering the kitchen garden, no anything until it was fixed. It meant a long, hot ride to the creek and back with buckets. He started toward the well, but Cora's voice stopped him again. "Let me see it," she said. Jed, a burly man with a perpetually suspicious scowl, had emerged from the barn. "This ain't woman's work," he grumbled to one of the other hands. Cora ignored him. She walked to the well, her skirts whispering in the dust. She knelt, her hands, so recently clean, not hesitating to touch the grimy broken cast iron. Samuel remained by the bags, a small, silent statue. Cora ran a finger along the break. It was jagged, crystalline. She looked at the frayed rope that had been used as a temporary fix. "It's cast iron," she said, more to herself than anyone. Fatigued, the stress was all in one place. She looked up at Elias, who was watching her with a baffled, grudging curiosity. "My father was a blacksmith, not a good one, but he taught me about metal. This can't be welded here. You need a new one, but I can rig it, for now. Do you have a length of flat iron, a drill, and the long-handled wrench from a wagon kit?" The men stared. Elias just nodded slowly. "Billy," he said to the young hand, "get her what she asked for." For the next hour, Cora Halloran worked. She did not speak. She took the tools and, with an economy of motion that was beautiful to watch, she went about her task. She had Billy help her brace the broken pieces. She drilled 2 holes on either side of the break in the handle, her movements sure and strong. She used the flat iron as a splint, bolting it tight. It was ugly, it was temporary. But when she was done, she stood up, wiped her greasy hands on her skirt without a thought, and nodded at the handle. "It will hold," she said, "but you'll need to pump slow and steady. No jerking." Silas, an old hand with a face like a dried apple, stepped forward. He was the quiet observer, the one whose opinion mattered most among the men. He worked the handle. It was stiff, but it held. Water, clear and cold, gushed into the bucket. He looked at the water. He looked at the boy. He looked at Cora. Then he looked at Elias and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Elias Thorne felt something shift inside him, something that had been locked down and rusted tight for years. It wasn't hope. It was something far more practical. It was the recognition of competence. It was the rarest and most valuable commodity in this entire territory. He walked back over to her. The sun was beginning to dip, painting the undersides of the clouds in shades of apricot and rose. "The cook's quarters are behind the kitchen," he said, his voice still rough, but with the grinding edge worn slightly smoother. "They're small." "Small is fine, Chumum," Cora said. "1 week," he said. It was not an offer, it was a challenge. "You get 1 week, you and the boy. You do what you said you could do. If you can, you stay. If you can't, you go. No wages for the first week, that's the deal." "That is a fair probationary period," Cora replied, her voice betraying no emotion. She bent and picked up her 2 bags. "Samuel?" The boy moved to her side, his small hand finding hers again. As she walked toward the small, dusty room that would be her home, Elias Thorne watched her go. He wasn't just looking at a desperate widow anymore. He was looking at the woman who had diagnosed his ranch's failures in a single glance and fixed his well with a wagon wrench. For the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of something other than exhaustion. He felt curiosity, and that he knew was a dangerous thing indeed. Clear's throat. The impact of Cora Halloran's presence was not a thunderclap. It was the scent of onions caramelizing in a skillet. It was the first thing the men noticed the next morning. Not the usual smell of burned coffee and greasy salt pork, but a rich, savory aroma that promised something other than mere sustenance. When they filed into the main house for breakfast, they found the long, scarred table scrubbed clean. In the center sat a platter of fluffy, golden-brown biscuits, steam still rising from their cracked tops. There was a bowl of gravy, thick and dark and laced with sausage, and coffee that smelled like coffee. Cora moved around the kitchen with a quiet efficiency that was almost unnerving. There were no wasted steps, no clatter of dropped pans. She ladled scrambled eggs onto their plates, eggs from the half-dozen scrawny chickens she'd found roosting in a neglected coop. Chickens no one had bothered with for months. She'd already cleaned their coop, put down fresh straw, and found a handful of cracked corn in the bottom of a feed sack. The men ate in a stunned, suspicious silence at first. Jed, the foreman, eyed his biscuit as if it might be a trick. He broke it open. It was light, airy, perfect. He dipped it in the gravy. His scowl, a permanent fixture on his face, seemed to falter for a moment. He did not say a word, but he took a second biscuit and then a third. Billy, the young hand, caught Cora's eye as she refilled the coffee pot. He gave a shy, grateful smile. She responded with a brief, almost imperceptible nod. It was an exchange that did not go unnoticed by Elias, who sat at the head of the table, eating slowly, watching everything. He watched her all day. After the men had left, she did not rest. She tied an apron made from a clean flour sack over her dress and began a systematic assault on the chaos of the kitchen. She inventoried the pantry, her lips a thin line as she noted the weevil-infested flour, the half-empty sacks of beans, the sticky unlabeled jars. She made a list, her handwriting neat and precise. She scrubbed the stove until the black iron gleamed. She found a pile of mending, torn shirts, split seams, missing buttons, and sat in a straight-back chair by the window, her needle flying with the same methodical purpose she'd applied to the water pump. Samuel sat on a small stool near her feet, a piece of charcoal and a smooth scrap of wood in his hands. He did not speak, but the quiet scratching of his drawing was a constant, soft counterpoint to the rhythmic dip and pull of his mother's needle. He was drawing the pump handle, the splint, the bolts. That evening, supper was a revelation. It was a simple beef stew, but it was unlike any stew the men had ever tasted at the Thorn Ranch. The meat, a tough cut from the last steer they'd butchered, was tender. There were potatoes, carrots, and onions, all simmered in a rich, savory broth that she had made by roasting the beef bones first, a step no one had ever bothered to take. And there was bread, not biscuits, but two long, crusty loaves of actual bread, baked in the temperamental wood oven she had somehow already mastered. Silas, the old man, took a bite of the bread, chewed it slowly, and closed his eyes for a moment. He had worked this ranch for 30 years, through Elias's father and now Elias. He'd eaten 1,000 meals at this table. He opened his eyes, looked down the table at Cora, who was ladling more stew for Billy, and he did something no one had seen him do in years. He picked up the small bowl of wildberry jam she'd unearthed from the back of the pantry and managed to salvage. He didn't take any himself. He passed it down the table, hand to hand, until it reached her. It was a gesture of respect so profound in its simplicity that it silenced the room. Cora looked at the bowl, then at the old man. "Thank you, Silas," she said softly. It was the first time anyone had used his name at the table in a long time. For 3 days, this was the rhythm: quiet competence, methodical improvement. The house began to feel less like a temporary shelter from the elements and more like a home. The floors were swept. The windows, once opaque with grime, were clean enough to let the fierce prairie sun shine through. The scent of baking bread and simmering soup replaced the old smells of dust and decay. Cora never seemed to hurry, yet she accomplished more in a day than any two people. She rose before the sun and was the last to bed, moving through her chores with an unflagging, steady energy. Not lazy, not beaten, just running on a kind of stubborn momentum that the hard land seemed to respect. The men, except for Jed, began to unthaw. They started wiping their boots before coming inside. They spoke more quietly at the table. Billy, in a moment of boldness, brought Samuel a small, intricately carved wooden horse. The boy looked at the horse, then at Billy, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than watchfulness appeared in his deep blue eyes. He took the horse. It was a beginning, but Jed's resistance hardened. He saw her competence not as a gift, but as a judgment on his own authority. She was an outsider, a woman, and she was changing things. The quiet order she was creating felt like a threat to the loud, masculine chaos he understood. The confrontation came on the 4th day. It wasn't about the food or the cleaning, it was about the ledger. Cora had spent the previous afternoon with the ranch's account book, a messy, ink-stained volume of sloppy arithmetic and forgotten debts. She had found her list from the pantry and now sat with Elias at the table after the midday meal, the book open between them. "Your supplier in Prairie Ridge is overcharging you," she said, her finger tracing a column of figures. "By 10% on flour and 15 on salt. And this last delivery of feed corn, the bill says 20 sacks. I counted 18 in the barn. 2 of them were half full of mealworms." Elias leaned forward, his brow furrowed. He hated the ledger. It was a symbol of the part of the ranching life he was worst at. The numbers, the tedious accounting that his father had always handled with ease. His last partner had nearly bankrupted him with clever bookkeeping, and ever since he'd avoided looking too closely, trusting to rough estimates and a general sense of solvency. A sense that had been fraying badly. "Henderson's been our supplier for years," he said, though the doubt was already creeping into his voice. It was then that Jed, who was supposed to be out checking the north fence line, walked in. He'd clearly been listening from the porch. "What's she doing with the books?" he demanded, his voice loud and accusatory. He directed the question at Elias, but his glare was fixed on Cora. "That ain't her place." "I asked her to look at them," Elias said, his tone low and dangerous. He did not like his authority being questioned in his own house. "She's saying Henderson's cheating us," Jed scoffed. "Henderson's a friend of mine. She's a stranger, been here 3 days, and suddenly she knows more about this ranch than I do?" He took a step toward the table. "You'd take the word of some drifter widow over me? A woman who probably got run out of her last town?" The air in the room went cold and tight. Samuel, who had been quietly drawing by the hearth, went utterly still. Cora did not flinch. She did not raise her voice. She simply looked up from the ledger, her hazel eyes meeting Jed's angry gaze without fear. She held the pen in her hand, its sharp nib pointed vaguely in his direction. It was not a weapon, but in that moment it felt like one. A weapon of intellect against brute ignorance. "I am not questioning your friendship with Mr. Henderson, Jed," she said, her voice calm and even. "I am questioning his arithmetic. These are numbers. They are not opinions. They do not care about friendships. They are either right or they are wrong. These," she tapped the page, "are wrong. Or more accurately, they are right for him and wrong for Mr. Thorne." "You're calling me a fool or a liar?" Jed snarled, his hands balling into fists. "I am calling you neither," Cora replied, her voice still maddeningly calm. "I am simply stating the facts as they are written on this page and as they exist in that barn. If you dispute them, by all means, let us go to the barn and count the sacks together. Let us get the scale and weigh the flour. Facts are stubborn things, Jed. They do not go away simply because we dislike them." Jed was left sputtering, trapped by her logic. He could not argue with a public counting. He knew she was right. He had been the one to sign for the delivery, too busy and too trusting to count himself. His own negligence was being laid bare. Elias Thorne had been watching the exchange, his face unreadable. He had seen men challenge each other with fists, with knives, with guns. He had never seen a man so thoroughly disarmed by a woman with a pen. She hadn't insulted Jed. She hadn't attacked him. She had simply held up the truth like a mirror, and he had buckled before his own reflection. Elias stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate. He was taller than Jed, and in that moment, he seemed to fill the room. "Jed," he said, his voice a low rumble, "you will go check the north fence line, now." Jed's face flushed a dark, mottled red. He looked from Elias's implacable face to Cora's calm one. He was beaten. He turned without another word and stalked out of the house, slamming the door behind him. The silence that followed was profound. Cora calmly placed the cap back on her inkwell. She did not look triumphant. She looked like a person who had simply stated the obvious. Elias sat back down. He looked at the ledger. He looked at her. "Show me," he said. "Show me the numbers." For the next hour she did. She walked him through the discrepancy, her explanations clear and concise. She showed him how the small overcharges, the shorted deliveries, added up over months. It was a slow, steady bleeding of his resources. It wasn't a grand theft, but 1,000 tiny cuts. He had been so focused on the big threats, blizzards, cattle prices, disease, that he had missed the enemy within his own supply chain. As she talked, Elias found himself listening, not just to the words, but to the mind behind them. She was intelligent, not just clever, but truly, deeply intelligent. Her observations were sharp, her logic unassailable. He saw the same methodical competence she applied to baking bread and mending clothes now applied to the very heart of his business. He's in league with Blackwood, Elias said suddenly, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. Marcus Blackwood was his neighbor to the east, a man with a smile as wide as his conscience was narrow. Blackwood had been trying to buy him out for years, making offers that were just a little too low, applying pressure in subtle, insidious ways. "Who is Blackwood?" Cora asked. "The man who wants this land more than anything," Elias said, a dark look crossing his face. "Henderson plays poker with Blackwood's foreman every Saturday night." Of course. It all clicked into place. It wasn't just simple cheating, it was sabotage, a coordinated effort to weaken him, to make him more desperate, more likely to sell. He looked at Cora, and his perception of her shifted once again. She wasn't just a good cook or an efficient housekeeper. She wasn't even just a smart bookkeeper. She was a diagnostician. She had just found the source of a disease he didn't even know he had. That evening, as the sun set, Elias walked out to the small corral where he kept his personal horse, a big roan gelding. He leaned on the fence, the familiar smell of horse and hay a small comfort. He thought about the past 5 years since his partner's betrayal, the loneliness, the grinding work, the feeling of being besieged on all sides. He had been holding the ranch together with sheer will, but he knew deep down that will wasn't enough. The ranch was failing. He looked back at the house. A warm, yellow light now glowed in the kitchen window. He could see Cora's silhouette as she moved about, and a smaller shadow that was her son. For the first time in a very long time, the house looked like a home. He saw Silas walk past the window, pausing to look in before continuing to the bunkhouse. A moment later, Billy followed, whistling a tuneless song. Even Jed, when he'd returned from the fence line, had been subdued, his anger replaced by a sullen, grudging respect. He'd eaten his stew without complaint. Elias felt the tight knot of cynicism in his chest loosen just a fraction. He had offered her a week, a test, but he was the one who was being tested. She was holding up a mirror not just to his ledger, but to him, to his weariness, to his isolation. And he was beginning to see a reflection he didn't entirely recognize. A man who might still have a chance. He had hired a cook. What he was getting, he slowly realized, was an ally. And in this country, an ally was worth more than land, more than cattle, more than gold. It was worth everything. The next morning, Elias rode into Prairie Ridge. He didn't tell Cora where he was going. He just said, "I have business in town." He took the ledger with him. Cora watched him go, a knot of apprehension tightening in her stomach. Her week was not yet up. His quiet, abrupt departure could mean anything. It could mean he was going to verify her claims, or it could mean he decided she was too much trouble and was making arrangements to send her away. She pushed the thought aside. Worry was a rocking chair. It gave you something to do, but got you nowhere. She had work. She spent the day in a flurry of productive activity, a habit born of a lifetime of keeping anxiety at bay through labor. She enlisted Billy's help in turning the mattress in Elias's room, a task that hadn't been done in years. They beat the dust out of it in the yard, great choking clouds of it billowing into the bright, clean air. While they were in his room, she noticed a small locked chest at the foot of his bed. It was old, the wood dark and scarred. It was none of her business. She also found a stack of old journals on a dusty shelf, his father's by the look of the dates on the spines. She hesitated, then ran a cloth over them, setting them back in order. Her respect for privacy was absolute, but her mind, always working, filed the information away. History was kept in those books. In the kitchen, she tackled the root cellar, a dark, musty space that smelled of earth and forgotten things. She sorted the potatoes, throwing out the rotten ones. She organized the few jars of preserves that remained, and in the very back, behind a crumbling stone, her fingers brushed against something metallic. It was a small tin box. Inside, nestled in a yellowed cotton, was a pair of silver earrings, intricately shaped like hummingbirds. They were delicate, beautiful, and utterly out of place. Tucked beside them was a faded tintype of a young woman with a shy smile in Elias's eyes. A sister, perhaps, or a wife. Cora closed the box and put it back exactly where she had found it. The ranch held its secrets, just as she held hers. Illis returned late in the afternoon. His face was grim, but there was a new hardness in his eyes, the look of a man who had made a decision. He dismounted and without a word walked into the house, straight to the kitchen where Cora was kneading dough for the next day's bread. He looked at his hands. "You were right," he said, his voice low. "About all of it. Henderson folded like a cheap tent when I showed him your figures. Admitted everything. He won't be supplying this ranch anymore." Cora did not stop working the dough. Her hands, covered in flour, pushed and folded, pushed and folded. It was a steady, calming rhythm. "I am sorry it was true," she said. He looked at her then, truly looked at her. "No, you're not," he said, and a ghost of a smile touched his lips, the territory right next to one. "You're not sorry it was true. You're sorry it had to be true. There's a difference." She paused in her kneading, her gaze meeting his. He was right. She took no pleasure in uncovering deceit, only in setting things right. "What will you do for a supplier?" she asked, her mind already moving to the practical problem. "That's the other thing," he said. He pulled a chair out from the table and sat down, a weary sigh escaping him. "I went to see Miller over at the feed store. He's an honest man. We made a deal. Better prices than Henderson ever gave me, even on his honest days." He ran a hand over his face. "While I was there, the wire came in from Marcus Blackwood, his prize bull, the one he paid $1,000 for in St. Louis. It arrived on the afternoon train." Cora frowned, unsure of the relevance. "That is good for him." "It's a Hereford," Elias said. "A breeding bull. Blackwood's been switching his whole herd over from Longhorn. He aims to have the best stock in the territory." He paused, looking out the clean kitchen window toward the east, in the direction of Blackwood's ranch. "The thing is, there's a storm coming. A bad one. The old-timers can feel it in their bones. And the sky has that strange, yellowish tint. A blue norther. Could drop a foot of snow before midnight." The pieces began to click into place in Cora's mind. "The train station is in Prairie Ridge," she said, "and Blackwood's ranch is 20 miles east of there. My ranch," Elias said, a grim satisfaction in his voice, "is 10 miles west. The only ranch between the town and his spread with a barn sturdy enough to hold $1,000 bull through a blizzard." Cora understood. Blackwood, in his arrogance, had timed his prize acquisition poorly. He would be forced to ask a favor of the very man he was trying to ruin. It was a moment of supreme leverage. "He'll have to ask to shelter the bull here," she said. "He will," Elias agreed, "and I will grant it. For a fee, a steep one. And while his foreman is here, with his bull, I'm going to have a conversation with him about his association with a cheat like Henderson, about fair dealings between neighbors." It was a brilliant move. Not a direct confrontation with Blackwood, but a strategic flanking maneuver. It re-established his power, turned his enemy's asset into a liability, and did it all within the unwritten code of the West, offering shelter in a storm, for a price. "That is a good plan," Cora said, and the simple praise seemed to land on him with surprising weight. He looked up, and the weariness in his eyes was momentarily replaced by something else. Gratitude. Respect. "The week is up tomorrow," he said, changing the subject. "I am aware," she said, resuming her kneading. "You've done everything you said you would," he admitted, the words feeling clumsy in his mouth. "And more." He cleared his throat. "The job is yours if you want it. The $20 a month we discussed." Cora finished her kneading, shaped the dough into a smooth, perfect mound, and placed it in a greased bowl, covering it with a clean cloth. She wiped her hands. "I accept," she said, "on one condition." Ilias stiffened slightly. He was not a man who liked conditions. "What is it?" "You will let me manage the household budget," she said, "all of it. The supplies for the kitchen, the bunkhouse, the mending. You give me a set amount each month, and I will make it work. I will provide you with a full accounting at the end of each month. I can save you more money than you are paying me." He was stunned. He had expected a request for more money, a better room, shorter hours. He had not expected a demand for more responsibility, for more work. She wasn't just asking for a job. She was asking for ownership of a part of his ailing enterprise. She was offering to take a burden from his shoulders, not add to them. He looked at her, standing there in her flour-dusted apron, her face earnest, her eyes clear and direct. He thought of the balanced ledger, the mended shirts, the scent of baking bread, the quiet hum of order she had brought to his chaotic world. He thought of the tin box in the root cellar, a secret he thought was his alone, and wondered if she knew about that too. He found he wouldn't mind if she did. "All right, Cora," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name. "You have a deal." A sense of profound relief washed over her, so strong it almost buckled her knees. She had done it. She had turned competence into security. She had carved out a small, safe place for herself and her son in this harsh, unforgiving landscape. She had a home. For now. The blue norther hit that night, just as Elias had predicted. It came in not with a roar, but with a chilling, sudden silence. The ceaseless wind died. The air grew heavy, expectant. Then the first flakes of snow began to fall, fat and wet and silent. Just before dusk they had arrived. Blackwood's foreman, a man named Calloway, with shifty eyes and a condescending manner, along with two of his hands, leading the magnificent, bewildered-looking Hereford bull. The animal was a masterpiece of breeding, a solid, muscular block of red and white that looked comical and out of place against the muted tones of the Thorn Ranch. Calloway's request for shelter was dripping with false courtesy and barely concealed impatience. Elias met it with a stony politeness, naming his price for the night's lodging, a figure that made Calloway's eyes widen in outrage. "That's robbery," the foreman sputtered. "It's business," Elias replied calmly, gesturing toward the darkening, snow-filled sky. "My barn, my hay, my risk. Take it or leave it. But I'd make up your mind quick. It's a long, cold walk back to your camp." Grumbling, Calloway had agreed. The bull was settled in the warmest stall in the barn, a place of honor usually reserved for Elias's own roan. Calloway and his men were given space in the bunkhouse, a tense and unwelcome addition to the small community. The storm intensified. The wind returned with a vengeance, howling like a legion of grieving ghosts. Snow fell in a blinding, horizontal sheet, erasing the world, shrinking it down to the small, warm circle of light cast by the lamps in the ranch house. Inside the kitchen, a fragile peace reigned. Cora served a thick lentil soup, hearty and warming. The Thorn Ranch hands ate with their usual quiet appreciation. Calloway and his men ate sullenly, their presence a discordant note in the room. Jed watched them with a hawk-like intensity, his earlier animosity toward Cora now seemingly transferred to these new intruders. His loyalty, it seemed, was to the ranch, and these men were Blackwood's men. After the meal, Elias took Calloway into his small, cluttered office, the room that held the desk and the ledger. The door closed, and the low murmur of their voices was occasionally audible over the shrieking wind. Cora, clearing the table, knew that a different kind of storm was taking place in that room. An hour later, the office door opened. Calloway emerged, his face pale and tight. He looked shaken. He did not meet anyone's eye as he collected his men and retreated to the bunkhouse. Elias stood in the doorway, watching them go. He looked tired, but there was a grim satisfaction on his face. He caught Cora's eye and gave a slight nod. The first battle had been won, but the victory was short-lived. The real crisis was not Calloway or the bull. It was the storm, and it was worse than anyone had anticipated. The next morning, they awoke to a world buried in white. The snow was 3 feet deep on the level and drifted up to the eaves of the bunkhouse. The world was silent, muffled, and dangerously beautiful, and Elias Thorn was gone. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Cora for a brief moment. She had risen before dawn as usual, only to find his room empty, his bed unslept in. His heavy winter coat and saddle were gone. Billy, his face white with worry, confirmed it. He'd seen Mr. Thorne saddle up in the middle of the night. He was worried about the cattle in the south pasture, the boy stammered. The ones near the canyon. He said the snow fence there was weak. He was afraid they'd drift over the edge in the whiteout. It was a brave, foolish, and entirely typical thing for Elias to do. To go out alone, into the teeth of the blizzard, to save his herd. The full weight of the situation fell on Cora's shoulders. She was in charge, not by appointment, not by desire, but by default. Elias was gone, possibly lost in the storm. Calloway and his men were a hostile presence, trapped with them. The ranch hands, good men, but used to taking orders, not giving them, were looking to her. Jed, Silas, Billy, all their eyes were on her when she walked into the kitchen. "All right," she said, her voice cutting through the anxious silence. It was the same calm, steady voice she had used on Jed, on Elias. It was the voice of competence, and it commanded attention. "First, we eat. A hot breakfast. Then we work. Billy, check the livestock in the barn. Make sure they have water and feed. We'll have to break the ice in the troughs. Silas, you know this land better than anyone. Can you tell from the drift where the wind was coming from last night? Which way he might have been pushed?" The old man nodded, his face grim. "Headed south. Wind was out of the northwest. It'd push him southeast toward the broken lands." "Jed," Cora said, turning to the foreman, her most vocal opponent. His support was crucial. "We need to organize a search, but we can't go out blindly. We need a plan. Ropes, supplies. We wait for first light to improve. And if it doesn't, we have to decide if a search is a rescue or a suicide mission." Jed looked at her, his expression a mixture of shock and a dawning, grudging respect. She wasn't panicking. She wasn't weeping. She was thinking, strategizing. She was leading. "Aye, ma'am," he said, the ma'am coming out without a trace of its former sarcasm. "You're right. We need a plan." Calloway, who had entered the kitchen, let out a derisive snort. "A plan? Your boss is likely frozen solid in a ditch somewhere. This ranch is finished. Soon as this storm breaks, Blackwood will take what's left for the debt Thorne owes him." The room went silent. Every eye turned to the foreman. "Debt?" Cora asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "That's right," Calloway sneered, enjoying his moment. "Your boss is more than just a bad manager. He's in debt up to his eyeballs. Blackwood holds the note on this place, a note that comes due in 2 days. He was planning to use the money from the bull to make the payment, but without him, well, it's a shame." It was a lie, a calculated, vicious lie designed to shatter their morale. But Cora didn't know that. The possibility of it, however, felt horribly real. It explained Blackwood's confidence, Henderson's cheating, the sense of a ranch under siege. But then something unexpected happened. Jed stepped forward, placing himself between Calloway and Cora. "Thorne don't have no note with Blackwood," he said, his voice a low growl. "He paid off the last of his father's bank loans 2 years ago. This place is free and clear. I was with him when he made the final payment. So you take your lies and you choke on them." The atmosphere in the kitchen crackled. Calloway, faced with Jed's righteous fury, faltered. His bluff had been called. Cora's mind, however, was racing past the confrontation. Debt or no debt, Elias was still missing. The ranch was still snowbound, and she was still in charge. She had to take control, not just of the ranch hands, but of the entire situation. "Jed is right," she said, her voice pulling the focus back to her. "This ranch is not finished." She turned her gaze to Calloway, and her eyes were chips of ice. "You and your men are guests here. Guests who are eating our food and warming yourselves by our fire. You will conduct yourselves as such. You will help with the chores, you will follow my orders, or you will be turned out into the storm. Your bull can join you. I imagine he won't last an hour. Is that clear?" Calloway was speechless. He looked from Cora's unyielding face to the circle of hard-faced ranch hands who were now standing with her. Jed, Silas, Billy. They were a united front. He was outnumbered and outmaneuvered. He gave a curt, angry nod. Cora turned away from him, the matter settled. "All right," she said to her men. "Let's get to work. We have a ranch to run and a boss to find." The day was a blur of controlled, purposeful action. Cora orchestrated the entire operation from the kitchen, the warm heart of the ranch. She sent Jed and Billy roped together to clear a path to the barn and check on the herd animals. She had Silas study the maps in Elias's office, plotting the most likely locations where a man and horse might have sought shelter from the wind. She herself managed the resources with a general's precision. She rationed the food, knowing they could be snowed in for days or even weeks. She set water to boil constantly, not just for drinking, but for the hot cloths and blankets they would need when they found Elias. She kept Samuel close, his silent, watchful presence a constant reminder of what was at stake. Not just a ranch, but a home, a future. Paragraph. Her mind was a whirlwind of logistics, but one thing Calloway said kept nagging at her: the debt. Jed had refuted it, but the idea had been planted. Blackwood was not a man to make idle threats through his foreman. If there wasn't a debt, there was something else. A different angle. What was it? While the men were out, she went into Elias's office. It felt like a violation, but necessity overrode propriety. She was not looking for secrets, but for answers, for anything that could help them. Her eyes fell on the old journals she had noticed before, his father's journals. Without hesitation, she took one down. It was dated 30 years prior. She didn't have time to read it, but as she opened it, a folded, yellowed piece of paper fell out. It was a hand-drawn map of the property, but it was different from the current one Silas had been studying. It showed a small line shack and a well in a part of the broken lands marked unusable. A notation in the margin, in faded ink, read, "Boundary dispute with Abernathy settled. Line runs north of the dry creek bed. His claim is void." Abernathy. The name meant nothing to her. Dry creek bed. She put the map in her apron pocket. It was a loose thread. And Cora Halloran had learned that loose threads, if pulled, could unravel entire deceptions. Late afternoon, the wind died down enough for a search party to be feasible. Jed and Silas, their faces grim, prepared to ride out. They would not go far, just checking the nearest gullies and rock formations. It was a slim hope. As they were about to leave, Samuel, who had been by the window all day, made a sound. It wasn't a word, just a soft, urgent noise. He pointed a small finger at the window. Cora looked. At first, she saw nothing but the endless, undulating white. Then she saw it, a dark shape, staggering, moving slowly, painfully, toward the house. It was Elias. He was on foot, his horse nowhere in sight. He was covered in snow, limping badly, using a broken branch as a crutch. But he was alive, and he was not alone. Slung over his shoulder, unconscious, was another man. Jed and Billy were out the door in a flash, plunging through the deep snow to help him. They brought him in, half carrying, half dragging him. He was frozen, exhausted, his face a mask of ice and stubble. But his eyes, when they found Cora's, were lucid. "The cattle," he rasped. "They're safe. Found a box canyon." "Never mind the cattle," Cora said, her voice thick with a relief that surprised her. She was already in motion, issuing orders. "Jed, get him to a chair by the fire. Billy, hot water and blankets. Silas, that whiskey you keep for medicinal purposes. Now." They got him settled, cutting away his frozen coat. His leg was injured, a nasty gash on his calf, and he was suffering from exposure. But he would live. The other man, they discovered, with a shock, was one of Blackwood's hands. The second man Calloway had brought with him. "Found him by the creek," Elias mumbled as Cora cleaned his wound. "Horse fell. Broke its leg. He was trying to walk back. Fool." Even in his exhausted state, the code of the West was absolute. You don't leave a man to die in a storm, not even your enemy's man. The rescue of one of their own, by the man they were plotting against, seemed to break something in Calloway. He watched the scene, his face a mask of confusion and shame. Later that night, with Elias sleeping fitfully in his own bed for the first time, his leg bandaged, the ranch quiet and secure, Cora sat at the kitchen table. The storm had broken. Stars, hard and bright as diamonds, glittered in the cold, clear sky. The immediate crisis was over, but the larger one remained. Blackwood, the debt that wasn't a debt. She pulled the old map from her apron pocket and spread it on the table. She also took out the household ledger, the one she now managed. She had been going over the ranch's official property deeds and tax records, which Elias kept in his desk, trying to understand the business from the ground up. She looked at the old map. She looked at the new one, and she saw it. the dry creek bed. On the old map, the Thorne property line was clearly marked as running north of the creek. On the new official survey map, the one filed with the county, the line ran south of it. It was a difference of only a few hundred yards. But in that sliver of land was a spring, the only reliable, all-season water source for miles in that section, the section Blackwood had been buying up piece by piece. Her mind flashed back to the notations in the old journal. Boundary dispute with Abernathy settled. Abernathy had owned the land Blackwood now possessed. The dispute had been about that creek, and Elias's father had won. But the new map showed he had lost. She got up and went to the desk. She found the official deed. The survey had been redone 5 years ago, just after Elias's treacherous partner had left, and just before Blackwood had begun his aggressive purchasing of the surrounding land. The survey had been commissioned by the county, but the request had been quietly instigated and paid for by a concerned party. It was all there. It wasn't a debt of money. It was a theft of land, a quiet, legal, insidious theft. Blackwood hadn't needed to put Elias in debt. He had simply stolen his water. Without that spring, the adjacent thorn pasture was worthless for grazing in the dry season. It made that section of Elias's land untenable, forcing him to overgraze other areas, weakening his position, making him look like a failing rancher. It was a long game, and Blackwood had been patiently waiting for the final checkmate. Calloway's talk of a note was a bluff, a smokescreen to hide the real crime. He wanted Elias to be so worried about a fake debt that he wouldn't look for the real knife in his back. Cora stood in the silent office, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place with chilling precision. This was the threat. Not a stampede, not a blizzard, but a line on a map. A lie written in surveyor's ink. She knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that Blackwood would come as soon as the snow cleared enough for a horse to get through. He would come not to ask about his man or his bull, but to deliver the final blow, to make his final, insulting offer on a ranch he had already crippled. And she would be ready for him. She held the proof in her hands, not just the old map, but the journal entry, the testimony of a dead man against a living thief. It wasn't ironclad legal proof, but in the court of reputation and community opinion, the only court that truly mattered out here, it was a hanging offense. The next 2 days were a period of tense, quiet waiting. The snow began to melt under a relentless sun, turning the world into a mess of mud and slush. Elias was recovering, his leg propped up by the fire, his temper foul but his strength returning. He was a terrible patient. He listened in stony silence as Cora laid out her discovery, his knuckles white as he gripped the arms of his chair. He had been so blind, so consumed by the betrayal of his partner, that he had missed the far greater betrayal by his neighbor. "He did it while I was in Denver," Elias said, his voice rough with self-recrimination. "I was sorting out the mess my partner left. I trusted the county surveyor." "You trusted the law," Cora corrected him gently. "That is not a flaw. Blackwood is the one who perverted it. Calloway and his men were subdued. They helped with the chores, their arrogance gone, replaced by a grudging respect. The man Elias had rescued would live. He was weak but grateful. The code had been honored, and it had shamed them. On the third morning they came. Marcus Blackwood, dressed in a fine store-bought coat, riding a magnificent black stallion. He was flanked by 2 hard-faced men Cora had never seen before. He wasn't here to negotiate. He was here to collect. The entire ranch seemed to hold its breath. Jed, Silas, and Billy gathered on the porch of the bunkhouse, their hands conspicuously empty of weapons, but their posture radiating a quiet solidarity. Elias, using a makeshift crutch, stood on the main porch, his face a thundercloud. Cora stood beside him. Samuel, holding her hand, was a small, still point in the unfolding drama. "Thorne," Blackwood began, his voice smooth and oiled as a new saddle. "I heard you had some trouble. I also heard you were kind enough to shelter my foreman and my bull." He smiled, a flash of white teeth in a tanned, handsome face. It was the smile of a predator. "The bull is fine," Elias grunted. "Your man is alive. No thanks to you." "Fortunes of the trail," Blackwood said with a dismissive wave. "I've come to settle up. The lodging for my bull and other matters." He let his gaze sweep over the ranch, a look of proprietary assessment. This last storm was a bad one. I imagine it cost you cattle, resources. A man can only take so many hits before he breaks, Elias. I'm prepared to make you a final offer for this place. A generous one, considering its condition. Enough for you to pack up and start fresh somewhere else. Somewhere easier. It was the moment of climax, the final, condescending push. But instead of Elias, it was Cora who spoke. She took a single step forward. She was just a woman in a simple dress, her hair pulled back in a severe bun. She held no weapon. In her hands were only two pieces of paper, the old yellowed map and a single page she had carefully removed from the journal. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice carrying in the clear, cold air, "we are not interested in your offer, but we are interested in this." She held up the map. "This is a map of the Thorne property, drawn in 1858 and attested to by your predecessor, Mr. Abernathy, and Elias's father. It shows the property line north of the dry creek." Blackwood's smile faltered. His eyes narrowed. "Old maps are a dime a dozen. The county survey is what matters." "Ah, yes, the survey," Cora said, her tone still maddeningly polite. "The one conducted 5 years ago at the request of an anonymous concerned party. The one that quietly moved the boundary line and gifted you the Miller Spring. Were you that concerned party, Mr. Blackwood?" A murmur went through the assembled men. This was the heart of it. Blackwood's face darkened. "That is a ridiculous accusation. The survey is a legal document." "And this," Cora said, holding up the journal page, "is a legal testimony. It is a sworn entry in a journal, admissible in some courts, describing the original settlement of the boundary dispute. But more importantly," and here her eyes met his and held them, "it is a story of how your entire enterprise, your fine Hereford herd, your expanding ranch, is built on a lie, on the theft of water from a neighbor." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The words landed like stones in the quiet yard. That's slander," Blackwood sputtered, his composure finally cracking. He looked to his men for support, but they were staring at him, their expressions uncertain. "Is it?" Cora asked. "I wonder what the other ranchers in this territory would think of that story. Men who rely on handshake deals and the honor of a man's word. Men whose entire livelihood depends on shared water rights and honest boundaries. I wonder what Sheriff Miller, whose cousin's feed store you tried to bankrupt, would think of it. A story like that, it could ruin a man's reputation. And in this territory, a man's reputation is all he has." It was a complete, unconventional victory. She hadn't used a gun or a threat of violence. She had used the truth. She had used his own ambition and greed against him, and she had done it publicly. She had targeted not his body, but his name. Blackwood sat on his fine horse, his face a mask of fury. He was beaten. He looked from Cora's calm, resolute face to Elias's thunderous one, to the line of silent, judging men. He had lost the support of the community before the battle had even been fought. His power, which was built on an illusion of wealth and legitimacy, had been exposed as hollow. Without another word, he wheeled his horse around and galloped away, his two men scrambling to follow. He left his foreman, his rescued hand, and his $1,000 bull behind. He was a man in full retreat. The silence he left behind was heavy, profound. Then from the bunkhouse porch, old Silas started to clap. A slow, steady, deliberate clap. Jed joined in, then Billy. Soon the whole yard was filled with the sound of their applause. It wasn't for Elias. It was for her. Elias leaned on his crutch, the anger draining from his face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated awe. He looked at Cora, this quiet woman who had arrived on his doorstep with nothing but 2 carpet bags and a silent boy. This woman who had faced down his foreman, his creditors, and his greatest enemy, all without raising her voice. She turned to him, a faint flush on her cheeks, the only sign of the strain she had been under. "I believe the matter is settled," she said, as if reporting on the state of the pantry. Elias let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh. It was a rusty sound, but it was genuine. "Yes, Cora," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "I believe it is. That evening, the atmosphere in the ranch house was transformed. It was celebratory. Calloway, humbled and ashamed, formally apologized to Elias and offered to work off the debt for the bull's lodging. The rescued hand swore his loyalty. The threat that had hung over the Thorn Ranch for years had been lifted. Weeks later, when the mud had dried and the prairie was starting to show the first blush of green, Elias found Cora in the kitchen, a place that now felt more like the heart of the home than any other. She was showing Samuel how to shell peas, his small fingers clumsy but determined. For the first time, she had heard him whisper a word. "Green," he had said, holding up a single pea. Elias cleared his throat. He held a sheaf of papers in his hand. "Cora." She looked up. "Elias." He walked to the table and sat down, laying the papers between them. "I've been to Prairie Ridge," he said. "I saw a lawyer. He's filed a formal challenge to the survey. With the journal and the old map, he says we'll win. Blackwood has sold his herd and is moving on. His reputation, as you predicted, did not survive the story." "That is good news," Cora said, her relief palpable. "It is," he agreed. He pushed the papers toward her. "This is better news." She looked at the papers. They were legal documents. Her brow furrowed as she read the dense formal language. Then her eyes widened. "This is a deed," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It is," he said. "A new one. It's a partnership agreement. It makes you a full partner in this ranch. 40%. It's less than you deserve, but it's what I can afford to offer." She stared at him, speechless. A partnership. Not a wage. Not a job. A stake. A home. She started, but the words wouldn't come. "Cora," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "I was running a failing ranch. I was a failing man. I was so busy fighting the ghosts of old betrayals that I couldn't see the real threats right in front of me. You didn't just save the ranch. You saved me from myself." He looked at his hands, scarred and calloused from a lifetime of work. "This place, it needs more than just a strong back. It needs a sharp mind. It needs a steady hand. It needs a heart." He finally looked up, his eyes meeting hers. They were the gray of creek stones, but now they were warmed by an unfamiliar light. "The offer isn't charity, it's desperation. The desperation of a man who has found something valuable and is terrified of losing it." Cora looked from his earnest, vulnerable face to her son, who was now lining up the green peas in a perfect, straight row. She thought of their arrival, dusty, destitute, and desperate. She thought of the journey, the small victories, the building of trust, the forging of a new life from the ashes of the old. She had come seeking refuge. She had found a home. She had come asking for a wage. She was being offered a future. She reached out and her hand covered his on the table. Her touch was warm, steady. "I accept," she said. The final scene was not one of high drama, but of quiet, profound peace. Months later, as autumn painted the cottonwoods along the creek a brilliant gold, a visitor might have looked into the Thorn Ranch house on a cool evening. They would have seen a man with graying temples sitting by the fire, reading a book, a comfortable look of contentment on his face. They would have seen a woman at the big kitchen table, her head bent over a ledger, a small smile playing on her lips as the numbers added up right. And they would have seen a small boy on the floor, drawing with a set of colored pencils she had bought with her first share of the profits. He was not drawing a broken pump or a scary blizzard. He was drawing a house with a curl of smoke rising from the chimney. And in front of the house, he was drawing 3 figures, holding hands. The ranch had hired a cook because it was desperate for help. What it got, in the end, was the woman who made it a home.